All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep. Like, if you've ever wondered why anything is the way it is, well, this one's for you.
Yeah, we're tackling some of those really big questions today. If you're a philosophy fan,
Mm.
this deep dive into Continental rationalism is going to be right up your alley. It's a huge, complex topic, but we're going to break it down.
We're going to make sense of all those big thinkers from that era, the ones who are obsessed with figuring out the nature of knowledge and reality.
And you'll see how their ideas still resonate with us today.
Okay, so first things first. What exactly are we talking about when we say continental rationalism? It sounds kind of intimidating, but it's just a name for a bunch of shared ideas from these really influential European philosophers back in the late 1600s and early 1700s.
Yeah, think Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, those guys. They each had their own unique systems, but they had some core principles in common, especially when you compare them to the British empiricists over in England.
Right. And at the heart of it, rationalism is all about how we know things epistemology. But, and this is where it gets interesting, you quickly realize it's tied up with metaphysics too.
Yeah, totally. The rationalists weren't just interested in how we know things. They were also interested in the nature of reality itself. Like, what is this stuff we're made of? What's the fundamental reality underneath everything we see and experience? And they had a specific answer to that. Substance.
Substance. Okay, so we're already getting philosophical. What exactly did they mean by that? Like, what's the link between rationalism and substance?
Well, at its simplest, rationalism says that reason and intuition are the main ways we gain knowledge. So instead of just relying on what our senses tell us, the experiences we have, it emphasizes the power of our minds to figure things out on their own.
So it's less about, I saw it, so it must be true, and more about, I can reason this out, therefore it must be true.
Exactly. And for rationalists, this often involved believing in innate ideas, like some knowledge is just built into us from birth. They were looking for that kind of knowledge that's unshakable, certain, not just, like, probably true.
So there's that epistemological side, how we know stuff. But you mentioned a deeper connection to metaphysics, right? Like, what's real?
Yeah, they weren't just saying reason is cool. They were making a huge claim about reality itself. They believed in this underlying principle of unity called substance. They thought that underneath all the change and chaos we see in the world, there's this fundamental reality that connects everything.
So that's kind of like Plato, right? With his forms, the perfect blueprints behind everything.
It is. There's definitely a link there.
Yeah.
Plato drew a parallel between the types of things we can know and the ways we know them. And the Continental rationalists, they followed a similar logic. They thought that the differences between, say, understanding something and just sensing it, those aren't just arbitrary categories. Those differences are based on real differences in the nature of being itself.
Oh, okay. So the way we know things reflects a deeper order in reality itself.
Exactly. They even went as far as to say that the order of being and the order of knowing, they're not really separate. The distinctions we make are more about how our minds think than about reality itself. It's the distinction of reason, they called it.
So if we're thinking like these rationalists, we can actually use reason to get to the bottom of what's real.
You got it. And that takes us to this massive question Leibniz posed, the one that keeps philosophers up at night. Why is there something rather than nothing? And the rationalists, they had this answer that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, to Parmenides. They thought that at least some part of reality has to exist necessarily, meaning it can't not exist. It just has to be.
Yeah.
They often thought this necessity was like logical necessity. Think of it this way. You can't have a square circle. That idea contradicts itself. It's logically impossible. The rationalists thought some parts of reality are like that they just have to exist based on pure logic.
Whoa. Okay, so that's some serious metaphysical heavy lifting. But if something just has to exist because of logic, where does that leave our everyday experience? The stuff we see and feel and touch.
That's where things get really interesting. Because if fundamental reality can be known just by thinking, without needing any experience, then the importance of our senses, our experiences, starts to fade.
So for these rationalists, the really real stuff, the stuff that matters, is the stuff you can figure out with your mind alone.
Exactly. And they even took it a step further and said that causal connections, cause and effect, aren't something we just observe in the world. They're more like logical entailment. Things happen because they have to, based on this principle of sufficient reason.
Sufficient reason? What's that, like a cosmic rule book?
Basically, the principle of sufficient reason says everything that happens for a reason. Everything has an explanation, even if we don't know what it is. It's like the philosophical version of saying everything happens for a reason. And for the rationalists, that reason often looked a lot like a logical deduction.
Okay, that makes sense. But if everything has to have a reason, and that reason is basically logic, then it seems like it's all connected. You mentioned monism before, right?
Exactly, you're on the right track. If there's just one ultimate necessary reality, then it's hard to explain how we get all these separate individual things. So there was this push within rationalism, especially with Spinoza, towards monism,
Monism.
the idea that there's only one fundamental substance. Everything else, all those things we think of as separate, like you and me in this table, they're just kind of temporary modifications of this one big, infinite substance.
So basically, everything is just one big interconnected
Yeah.
thing.
Yep, that's a pretty good way to put it. Spinoza was a radical thinker, and his idea of monism really shook things up. It's a totally different way of looking at the world.
So rationalism had this focus on reason and this kind of monistic view of reality. But it wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? The new science, all those scientific discoveries were happening at the same time. How did those play into this?
Right, the scientific revolution was a huge influence on these philosophers. Think about it. Discoveries like the laws of motion, the heliocentric model of the solar system, these were radically changing how people understood the universe. They were moving away from the old Aristotelian view, where the Earth was at the center of everything and purpose was built into the universe.
Right. Aristotle thought everything had a telos, a goal it was striving for, even rocks.
Exactly. And they were moving towards a more mechanistic picture, like a giant clockwork universe governed by mathematical laws. This shift had a big impact on philosophy, pushing it in a more Platonic or Pythagorean direction. You know, Plato and Pythagoras, they emphasized mathematical reasoning and these underlying structures that explain the world.
So the new science pushed philosophy toward these ancient Greek ideas.
Yeah, in a way, it was like a revival of ancient Greek thought, but with a modern twist. However, it's not like the rationalists just threw out all of Aristotle. They still held on to some of his key ideas, especially his concept of gausia substance.
Okay, so Aristotle was still in the mix. But remind me, what exactly was his idea of oovia? It sounded like it had a few different meanings.
Yeah, it's a tricky concept. In his work called The Categories, Aristotle mainly used ovia, substance, to refer to individual things,
Hmm.
like this particular horse or that particular tree. These were proper substances, the most basic things in the world, the things that have properties but aren't themselves properties of anything else.
Okay, so substance as a particular thing.
But then in the metaphysics, Aristotle digs deeper. He talks about substance in a couple of different more abstract senses, hypokaimenon and form. Hypokaimenon is like the ultimate underlying stuff that everything's made of. It's the thing that doesn't depend on anything else to exist. And then there's form, which is basically the essence of a thing, what makes it the kind of thing it is.
So Aristotle gives us this double way of thinking about what's fundamental. On one hand, you have the individual thing itself, and on the other, you have this underlying nature, the form.
Exactly. And that tension between substance as a particular thing and substance as this shared essence, well, the rationalists were really interested in trying to figure that out. They wanted to understand how these two aspects of substance fit together.
I see. So in the categories, Bucephalus, Alexander the Great's horse, is substance. But in the metaphysics, the substance might be the matter that makes up Bucephalus, or the form of horseness that defines him.
That's a perfect example. And this tension between difference and sameness within substance, well, that's something the 17th century rationalists were trying to grapple with. They each had their own take on it. But generally, they wanted to emphasize the sameness over the difference.
They wanted to find the unity, the common ground.
Yes, they saw substance playing these three big unifying roles, connecting different attributes of a single thing at one time, connecting the different states of a thing over time, and connecting a thing to its kind, its essence. Most of them were trying to find ways to hold on to the idea of individual substances while also recognizing this deeper unity.
But Spinoza just went all in on the unity, right?
Yeah, for Spinoza, that unity, that fundamental connection, was the core of everything. Individual things were just temporary expressions of this one substance.
Wow. Okay, so we've laid some groundwork here. We've got rationalism, this emphasis on reason and intuition, and we've got substance, this ultimate reality that connects everything. Now let's get to Descartes, who many see as the father of modern philosophy.
Yeah, Descartes is a great place to start. He really kicked off the whole modern philosophy thing with his focus on finding certainty and building a solid foundation for knowledge. But like any good philosopher, he wasn't without his critics and his problems.
Okay, let's dig into that. What were some of the issues with Descartes' version of rationalism?
Well, for one thing, His theory of knowledge, his epistemology, sometimes gets all the attention. People forget that he also had some pretty strong ontological views about what exists, about the nature of reality. And those were just as important to his whole system.
So it wasn't just how we know, but also what we know, what's actually out there.
Exactly. But maybe the biggest head scratcher for many people is his radical voluntarism.
Radical voluntarism. That sounds intense.
It is. It basically means that Descartes thought all truth, even what we think of as necessary truths, like the laws of logic and math, ultimately depends on God's will.
So it's not just that what seems necessary to us might not be. He's saying that even the most basic truths, like 2 plus 2 is 4, could have been different if God wanted them to be.
Yeah, that's the crazy part. He didn't just think that God could have made a world where logic works differently. He argued that God's will is so free, so unconstrained, that even logical contradictions could have been true at the same time if God had decided that way.
So even the laws of logic are just God's opinion.
Pretty much. And this is where a lot of philosophers, both back then and today, have a hard time with Descartes. They're like, hold on, if reason itself isn't reliable, then what are we left with? How can we even trust our own thoughts?
It's like saying there's no ultimate standard for truth, which kind of defeats the whole point of trying to build a rational system, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox. And yet Descartes seems to have used this doctrine of created truth as a foundation for his physics and maybe even his whole philosophy. He even used it to set up his famous radical doubt in the Meditations.
Oh, yeah. The evil demon. That's classic Descartes. Remind me how that works again.
So Descartes starts by saying, what if there's this super powerful evil demon who's tricking me about everything? What if I can't even trust my senses or basic logic? He pushes this doubt to the absolute limit.
So even things we normally take for granted, like that we have a body or that 2 plus 2 is 4, he's questioning all of it.
Exactly. Now, there's some debate about just how powerful this demon is. Margaret Wilson, a philosopher who's written a lot about Descartes, argues that God didn't have to be able to create contradictions just to deceive us about eternal truths. But still, the point is that Descartes uses this radical doubt to try and find something absolutely certain, something he can't doubt.
And that leads him to the famous, I think, therefore I am, right?
You got it. The cogito. He realizes that even if he's being deceived about everything else, the very act of doubting, of thinking, proves that he exists. That's his first unshakable truth, the foundation of his whole system.
And from there, he tries to rebuild his knowledge of the world piece by piece, right?
Yeah, it's like a philosophical puzzle. He tries to figure out what else he can know for sure, based on that one starting point. And as he goes through this process in the Meditations, he's also making these big claims about the nature of reality.
Like what?
Like the mind's independence from the body, the nature of physical objects, the famous wax example of the existence of God, and finally the existence of the external world itself. He's trying to ground all of these things on the foundation of the cogito.
And that's where that famous circularity objection comes in, right? The one from Arnaud.
Hmm.
He pointed out that Descartes seems to use reason to prove that God exists, but then he turns around and says we can only trust reason because God guarantees it.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. Descartes thought he had a way out of that circle, but it's still a point of contention among philosophers today. Some see it as a fatal flaw in his whole project. Others see it as a more subtle issue, or even a strength.
So it's like he's trying to pull himself up by his bootstraps, using reason to justify itself.
That's one way to put it. He's trying to show that reason, even though it can be doubted, is ultimately the best tool we have for understanding the world. He's arguing that if you apply reason consistently, it actually undermines skepticism rather than supporting it. He's almost a bootstrap rationalist, using innate reason to assert his own existence as a foundation for knowledge.
Okay, so back to this doctrine of created truth. How did Descartes explain God creating eternal truths? Like, if logic and math are just God's opinion, then what does that even mean?
Descartes argued that God created eternal truths the same way he created everything else ex nihilo, out of nothing. He's the ultimate cause, not only of the existence of things, but also of their very essence, their nature. And the eternal truths in this view are just the essences of created things.
So, like, the idea of a triangle with its 3 sides and angles, that's just part of the essence of triangles, and God created that essence.
Right, and this connects to his concept of substance. In his principles, he defines substance as something that exists independently, something that doesn't need anything else to exist. Strictly speaking, he said, this only applies to God.
Okay, so God's the ultimate substance.
Yeah, but then he said there's a secondary sense of substance that applies to created things, minds, and bodies. He said they're substances in the sense that they only depend on God for their existence. They're really distinct from each other if you can conceive of one existing without the other.
Really distinct.
It means they're not just different in our minds, they're actually a different reality. This idea of real distinction was really important for Descartes. He wanted to show that minds and bodies are fundamentally different kinds of things.
So if you can imagine a mind without a body or a body without a mind, then they're really distinct, like a ghost or a zombie.
Yeah, those are good examples. Now, this emphasis on conceivability as a test for real distinction, it has some unintended consequences. It actually opened the door for Spinoza's monism.
Really? How so?
Because if you think about it, if causal independence is the ultimate test of substance, then only God really fits the bill. Everything else depends on God for its existence. So in a way, Descartes' own logic pointed towards the idea that there's only one true substance.
Huh, that's interesting. And what exactly counted as a created substance for Descartes? Was it individual things, or was it broader categories like mind and body?
That's where things get a bit murky. Sometimes he talks about individual objects, like a piece of wax, as substances. But in other places, like the synopsis to the Meditations, he suggests that there might only be a single, extended substance body and a single thinking substance mind. Individual things would then be just modes, modifications of those.
So like my body is just a modification of this one big universal body.
Something like that. At the very least, there's an asymmetry in how he treats minds and bodies. He's not totally consistent. This might reflect that tension we talked about earlier, that tension within Aristotle's idea of substance between the individual and the kind.
And that leads us to his famous dualism, right? Mind and body, two fundamentally different substances.
Yeah, and that leads to the infamous mind-body problem. If minds and bodies are so different, how do they interact? How can my non-physical mind cause my physical body to move? Elizabeth of Bohemia really grilled Descartes on this point.
Yeah, Elizabeth was a sharp thinker. She wasn't going to let Descartes off the hook with vague answers.
Totally.
Yeah.
She pointed out that if the mind is non-physical, then it can't possibly have any contact with the physical world. And if it can't have contact, then how can it cause anything to happen in the world? It's like trying to push a car with your thoughts. It just doesn't make sense.
So what did Descartes say to that?
Well, his response wasn't very convincing, to be honest. He kind of dodged the question. He talked about a primitive notion of the mind-body union that we just understand intuitively through our senses. But Elizabeth wasn't satisfied. She even suggested that maybe part of the soul is extended, physical, so that it can have contact with the body.
She was ahead of her time, pushing Descartes to think outside his dualistic box.
Definitely. Now, Descartes also had this other theory, his theory of ideas, that was supposed to help bridge the gap between mind and world. This was a bit more promising, but it still had its own challenges.
Tell me about it. What were ideas supposed to do?
Well, but Descartes thought that to know something is to have an idea of it. And that idea, for him, is the thing known. He made this distinction between formal reality, the idea as it exists in the mind, and objective reality, the idea as a representation of something in the world.
Okay, two sides of the same idea, basically.
Yeah, but he went further and said there's actually no real distinction between them. They're just different ways of thinking about the same thing. This was a clever move because it avoided the problem of ideas becoming this third thing, separating us from what we're trying to know.
So it's like a direct connection.
Exactly. And this led to the idea that there are no false ideas, in the sense that every idea is meant to represent something. It doesn't mean every idea is accurate, but that every idea is, in a way, pointing at an object. This emphasized the transparency of the mind, the idea that the mind just sort of grasped its objects directly without any distortion.
Okay, so ideas connect our minds to the world. Makes sense. But I know this isn't the end of the story, right? What about Anton Amos' critique of Descartes on sensation?
Yeah, Amos is an interesting figure, a Ghanaian philosopher who studied in Europe and really engaged with all the big philosophical questions of his time. He agreed with the rationalists about substance being real, but he took issue with Descartes' idea that the mind itself can sense things.
What was his problem with that?
Well, Amo defined the mind as this purely active spiritual substance, and he argued that sensation, by its very nature, is passive. We receive sensations, we don't actively create them.
So for Amos, sensing was something the body did, not the mind.
Exactly. He saw sensation as belonging to the body, not the mind. And he argued that Descartes' view actually diminished the specialness of the mind. By attributing sensing to the mind, Descartes was, in a way, bringing it down to the level of the body.
Interesting. So Amos was a dualist too, like Descartes, but with this crucial difference.
Exactly. And Amo also pointed out that by focusing on the mind's role in sensing, Descartes was overlooking the essential role of the body in our experience of the world. For Amo, living and sensing were inseparable.
You can't have one without the other.
Right. And to live is to be embodied. So he shifted the focus back to the body and its role in sensation.
Now, Amos' view raises the same question Descartes faced. If the body senses but the mind doesn't, how do they communicate?
Good point. And Amo tries to address this by saying that an idea is actually a composite thing. It's the mind making a bodily sensation present to itself. So the body does the sensing, and then the mind sort of takes that sensation and makes it into an idea. The exact mechanism was a bit unclear, but it's a fascinating attempt to bridge the gap between mind and body while still maintaining their distinctness.
Yeah, it's kind of like what Elizabeth was suggesting with the idea of an extended part of the soul.
Totally. They were both trying to find a way to make sense of how these two different things, mind and body, could possibly communicate and influence each other.
So we've got Descartes grappling with dualism and Amo highlighting the crucial role of the body in experience. Now, Malebranche enters the picture, taking inspiration from Descartes, but also seeing ways to improve upon his system, right?
Yes. Malebranche is another big figure in Continental rationalism. He was a devoted follower of Descartes, but he also saw some weaknesses in his system, especially in the theory of ideas. He felt that Descartes hadn't fully grasped the extent of our dependence on God, and that his theory could actually lead to skepticism. Malebranche drew heavily on Augustine to address these issues.
Oh, interesting. So he was bringing in theological ideas to refine Descartes' system?
Exactly. He was very devout, and he saw philosophy as ultimately serving the goals of theology. He wanted to show how reason, properly understood, leads us back to God.
Okay, so what was his main problem with Descartes' theory of ideas?
Well, Descartes said that ideas are the things we know. But Malebranche took this a step further. He looked at the kind of knowledge we have in mathematics, things like the Pythagorean theorem, and he pointed out that these truths are universal and necessary. They're true everywhere and always. They couldn't be any other way.
Right, they're not just true in this world, they're true in any possible world.
Exactly. But our minds, they're finite and limited. We're just little creatures in this vast universe. So Malebranche argued, how could our minds contain ideas that are so big, so all-encompassing? He said that those kinds of ideas couldn't possibly originate in our minds. They have to come from somewhere else.
So where did he think they came from?
God. He said that these ideas exist in God as the divine exemplars. They're like the blueprints that God used to create the world.
Okay, so it's like God has this giant library of ideas, and when we learn something, we're actually just tapping into that library.
That's a good analogy. He called this the vision of all things in God. It was a central idea in his philosophy.
So for Malebranche, when we see a tree, we're not actually seeing the tree itself, we're seeing the idea of the tree in God's mind.
Precisely. And knowledge, for him, comes through consulting reason. And reason, he identified with the Logos, the second person of the Trinity in Christian theology. Our desire to know is like a prayer that God answers through reason.
Wow, that's pretty mystical.
Yeah, Malebranche was definitely a mystical thinker, but he was also trying to stay true to Descartes' commitment to reason.
Now this vision of all things in God, it sounds a lot like Spinoza's monism. How did Malebranche deal with that? Like if we're all just seeing ideas in God's mind, then what about individual substances? What about me and you and this table?
Yeah, that's a really tricky issue for Malebranche. He wanted to hold on to the idea that individual things are substances, but it's hard to square that with his overall system. He stuck with Descartes' criterion for substance that it has to be conceivable apart from everything else. But this led him to some strange conclusions like any portion of extension is a separate substance.
So like if you cut a piece of paper in half, you've created two new substances?
Yeah, it's kind of absurd. This really stretched the idea of substance almost to a breaking point. And it seems to contradict the whole Aristotelian idea that substances are the things that have properties, not the properties themselves.
Right, it's like turning the whole concept inside out.
Exactly. And Malebranche's commitment to ousia, to sameness, was so strong that it even led him to view the mind as just substantial thought. Like there's this one big mind, and individual minds are just modifications of that.
So he's kind of blurring the lines between individual minds and a single universal mind.
Yeah, he's definitely moving in that direction. And it's not hard to see how this could lead to something like Spinoza's monism, even though Malebranche was trying to avoid that.
So lots of tension in Malebranche, but he's also known for this other big idea, occasionalism. What's that all about?
Right, occasionalism. It's his take on the problem of causation. Remember, Descartes had this problem with how the mind and body interact. Malebranche took this even further and said that actually nothing in the created world can really cause anything else.
Nothing. Wait, so how does anything happen?
For Malebranche, true causation requires necessary connection between the cause and the effect. He said the only such necessary connection is between God's will and its effects.
So only God can really cause anything.
Yeah. What we think of as causes like one billiard ball hitting another, those are just occasional causes. They're just the occasions on which God chooses to act.
So it's like God's playing billiards with the universe.
Kinda. But it's not like God is constantly intervening. Malebranche thought God set up the universe with these pre-established laws, and those laws dictate what happens on each occasion. He just uses the occasions we see to carry out his plan.
Okay, so there's still order and regularity, even though it's ultimately all God's doing. Now, while all this is going on with Descartes and Malebranche over in England, Margaret Cavendish was developing her own unique take on these issues. She was also interested in the problem of interaction. You mentioned that she had her own version of occasionalism.
She did. It's really interesting how she comes at it from a slightly different angle. Like Malebranche, she didn't think bodies could directly cause changes in each other. But unlike him, Cavendish thought nature is self-moving.
Self-moving, like it has its own internal energy.
Yeah. Malebranche saw everything in creation as inert, just waiting for God to act upon it. But Cavendish argued that created things have this inherent power of self-motion. And she thought this was really important for understanding how the world works.
Okay, so how did her occasionalism work?
Well, she believed that properties, like motion, can't be transferred from one thing to another. So when two bodies interact, say when a billiard ball hits another one, the first ball doesn't cause the second ball to move. It acts as what she calls an occasional cause.
It's like a trigger.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It triggers the second ball to move, but the actual cause of the motion is the second ball itself. Cavendish called this the principal cause.
So it's self-caused, but triggered by the other ball.
Exactly. And both Malebranche and Cavendish agreed that the original motion in the universe had to come from God. But they had slightly different views on how God did that. Malebranche emphasized this necessary connection between God's will and creation, like God's knowledge of the world just automatically determines what happens. So creation is kind of dependent on God's mind in a way.
Okay, God thinks it, and it happens.
Right. But Cavendish emphasized God giving this power of self-motion to all created things. She didn't think only immaterial souls had this power. She saw it as something inherent in all of nature. And this fit with her idea that the world is full of life and activity.
Interesting. So for Cavendish, God's command was more like setting things in motion and letting them run, rather than constantly controlling everything.
Exactly. And this gave her a more dynamic, lively picture of the universe than Malebranche's system. It's also pretty ironic that later, Hume, the famous empiricist, actually adopted a version of Malebranche's occasionalism for his own theory of causation, even though he didn't believe in God.
Oh, wow. Talk about a twist. So Hume, the guy who's all about experience, is drawing on ideas from this super religious rationalist.
Yep. Philosophy is full of surprises like that. He argued that we never actually observe causation. All we see is one thing happening after another. So occasional causes are the only kind of causes we can actually experience.
Fascinating. So we've got these different takes on causation and some really creative attempts to solve the mind-body problem. Now let's move on to Spinoza, who takes this whole idea of substance and, well, he kind of explodes it.
Yeah, Spinoza. He's the ultimate monist. He really took Descartes' idea of substance and ran with it in a way that nobody else did.
So Spinoza's all about substance, but in a totally different way than Descartes.
Totally different. Remember, Descartes was struggling to fit this idea of God as the ultimate substance with the existence of created substances like minds and bodies. But Spinoza, he just got rid of the distinction altogether.
He just merged everything into one.
Exactly. He said there's only one substance, period. And that substance is both God and nature at the same time.
Deus sive natura, his famous phrase, God or nature, it's all the same thing.
Right. He wrote this incredibly dense and challenging book called The Ethics, and his whole system flows from this one fundamental idea. For Spinoza, everything else, everything we see and experience, including ourselves, is just a modification, a mode of this one substance.
Okay, so no more dualism, no more separate mind and body. It's all God or nature.
Exactly. And this is a radically different way of thinking about the world, and it got him into a lot of trouble. He was accused of being an atheist, a heretic, all sorts of things.